All right, going back to our epilogue, like I said, we get all of the information that we did know in kind of this concise way. And just like us, we are all, I mean, there could, it's, the suggestion is that Vera is the one who's responsible for all of these deaths, or at least the final three, but who's responsible for the other ones? And then we also get the kind of police perspective in looking at the swan song. And all of the previous transgressions, and how there is very little evidence to convict a number of the people. We get their perspective on Bloor, the corrupt cop. We get our view of Vera, who they feel like she's this upstanding person of society. And we also get their perspective of Wargrave and his kind of the accusation that he's killed Edward Seaton. And we find out through the police that Edward Seaton was indeed guilty of his crime. So Wargrave never murdered anyone. Well, at least before he gets to the island, he never murdered anyone. So the other thing that they get is like what this kind of, well, why all of these people? And they are normal. I mean, why not? Why wouldn't anybody check out what's going on the island? And why would all of these people take the bait of going to the island? Like, are they stupid? But then the police are like, well, I get it. There's all this mystery and intrigue surrounding the island, and of course, no one suspects anything out of the unusual when all of these people show up. At least Frank Narcott doesn't, because they all look so normal. And of course, we know that they're not, because they are all, in their own way, murderers. But we also, like I said, we know what we know. We get what we know. But we also get stuff that we aren't privileged to in the narrative. And one of those is the fact that Vera's death has been cleaned up. Instead of finding the chair kicked over, the chair has been stood upright. So someone was there after she hangs herself, or after she hanged herself. And then we also get the introduction to this other character, Isaac Morris. And we know who he is because he is the one, we've heard his name before in the opening chapters, because he's the one who pays Philip Lombard 100 guineas to go to the island on behalf of Mr. Owen. He is also, we find out, the one who has procured the island on behalf of a third party. We also get his kind of backstory. He's a shady character. He's been involved with fraud. He's a dope dealer. He's a drug pusher. And he has so far been able to go without punishment for a variety of unscrupulous crimes. And that we also find out that he is another victim of our lovely Mr. UN Owen. He is death by overdose. He dies before they even go to the island. So is he the first victim, or is he the last victim? I don't know. You tell me. Anyways, Isaac Morris, and in his kind of introduction, also kind of gives us more questions than answers. What's his role? Why him? And how does he play a part in this larger narrative? And We find out those answers in just a second. So the epilogue in some way heightens the mystery. It gives us more questions than it does answers. And those answers are finally answered, or those questions are finally answered with our manuscript. And essentially it is this first person confession from the killer himself. It reveals the nature and motivations of that murderer and really connects all the dots to the questions that we have. And we find out in the manuscript that this murderer has kind of this paradoxical or contradiction in his nature, but he also says, well, I've always had this kind of romantic, fanciful imagination. And remember, Philip Lombard said all along that this killer has imagination, something that Bloor does not have, which is why he can't figure out who it is. He has this sadistic light in seeing and causing death, but also on the flip side, he has this strong sense of justice. And there's no wonder, according to the manuscript, that I chose law as my profession. And then there we have it. We know that all along our murderer has been Justice Wargrave. He is UN Owen. Lombard was right. And remember, I told you he is the most perceptive. He is the one who can kind of figure it out. But because he's duped Armstrong, he's able to kind of fool us all. He also says that he feels that despite the fact that he has this kind of delight in killing and death and all of those types of things, he cannot abide an innocent person suffering or dying by his acts. And which none of the victims, none of his chosen victims, none of the people that he puts together on this island, none of them are innocent. So he does not feel bad about his actions. We also kind of figure out, he tells us his plan and what it was all along. And part of that plan is inspired by his accused crime, the Edward Seaton case. And he says that he knew all along that Edward Seaton is not unlike his other victims or the members of the island party. He has this misleading appearance that makes a good impression on a jury, this good impression in society. However, underneath that appearance of goodness and of upstanding social whatever, he was capable of that kind of appearance hides who he really is, that true nature of his lack of humanity. He was able to brutally murder an elderly woman who trusted him. And I think that goes back to every single one of these murderers. All of the murders that Armstrong, MacArthur, Lombard, Marston, Bloor, Vera, all of them are responsible for killing people who trusted them. Armstrong's patients trusted him. MacArthur's soldier, or as his commanding officer, Arthur Richmond would have trusted him to do no harm. Lombard and the men he was supposed to be taking care of trusted him. Emily Brent and Beatrice Taylor trusted Emily Brent to, I mean, there's kind of that responsibility that every single one of these people had to their victims that they don't follow through with. So they don't take responsibility of the people who have trusted them, but they don't end up taking responsibility legally for their participation in that crime. So anyways, Edward Seaton inspires part of this plan, but during his time as a judge, he admits that he kind of loses his control of being able to, I mean, he wants to be judge and executioner as well. And remember, that's what Lombard says all along. So long on the bench, surely something would snap, and it does. He decides that he wants to kind of be a murderer, but not just any murderer. He has to set himself apart. And I think that goes back to that kind of narcissistic, egotistical kind of attitude that the judge has. Like he wants to play the role of God. And it can't be just any run-of-the-mill murder. It has to be a fantastic one. And he sets this kind of plan in motion once he hears, he gets this kind of story from a doctor friend of his who tells him the story of Mr. and Mrs. Rogers. And after he hears the story of Mr. and Mrs. Rogers, he begins to collect his victims, and he collects his victims by hearing various stories on his various travels. He finds out from a nurse about Dr. Armstrong. He finds out from these war gossips at his gentleman's club about MacArthur. Lombard and Emily Brent he finds from his various travels around places. Marston, it's just the luck of a draw of many cases that he's come across where something like that has happened. Bloor he finds by way of his own experience. He knows that he finds out from the rumor mill and the talk of the scandal and the corruption and all of that. And he particularly mentions that Bloor is one of the most despicable ones because policemen are servants of the law and they have a high order of integrity. But notice Bloor is not his last victim. Vera, he finds out the story directly from, you guessed it, Hugo, who really has this hard time kind of reconciling Vera's actions, how he feels about her, and how he feels about the death of his nephew. And it's very dissettling, his account of Vera. And he says, I love Vera, but what she didn't realize is that I loved the kid. And he also it talks about Isaac Morris some more. I mean, he's got to find a way of procuring this island and doing so without leaving a paper trail. So he comes across Morris, who's this kind of dope peddler, but he's also responsible for a girl's death. So that's how he comes to be one of the 10. And what causes him to kind of act on this plan, and in some ways it's kind of like this fantasy, this daydream, this kind of thing that, I'll never make it happen, but I really want to, kind of thing. But what causes him to act is that he is diagnosed with a terminal illness, the one that's incurable, and he knows he's dying. So he wants to live that fantasy before his death. He has no desire to have long-term suffering, and if he's going to go out, by golly, he's going to go out with a bang, and he does. And his first victim, Isaac Morris, goes, he takes care of before they ever go to the island. He says, I'll give you something for your indigestion, right? And then he tells us that the order of, he goes in and he explains, and I think that this kind of shows the narcissism of the judge. He's got to explain, the brilliance of his plan, right? He can't let it be unsolved. He's got to send this letter. He's got to get credit for the most brilliant of ideas. So he explains the order of their deaths, the orders of his victims' death are based on the varying degrees of guilt. The less guilty go first because there's no prolonged mental strain. The more cold-blooded of the killers would suffer. They would go last. So I think it's important to note that Marston is the first to go because he has no fear of moral responsibility. He doesn't get it. He's naive. He's just beyond. I mean, he would not feel the mental strain as the other guests would. And Mrs. Rogers, she's just kind of this accomplice after the fact in some ways, where her husband is the one who's more responsible for that death. And then he goes through and he explains that he's got to make his choice of an ally, and we talked about that. Armstrong, he plays on that pre-existing relationship, and he kind of highlights Lombard as the most obvious choice of a scapegoat. And then he explains how he carried out the plan one by one, how he was able to kill all of these people under the radar. Armstrong fakes his death, and then he talks about Vera. And remember, he says that Bloor is the most horrible example of a police officer, but remember, he's not the last one to die. Vera is, and Vera is what he calls his psychological experiment, the one he feels is the most cold-hearted, because I think about it, we've talked about this over the course of the last couple of weeks, that Vera is responsible for killing a child, and what greater responsibility is there to someone than to a child who there's that expectation that you care and nurture for them. Again, that's kind of the order of that's his thought process. And I don't know, what do you guys think? Do you think Vera's the one who's the most deserving to go last? I don't know. In some ways, yeah, but I don't know. I don't want to make any comment, but I think it's interesting that he chooses her as his final victim. And then he closes his letter with clues to his, he sets these clues up. I don't know how they didn't figure out it was me. I don't know how you haven't figured out it was me. I don't know how the police haven't figured out it was me. And he sets up the clues. He says that his accusation on the swan song should have been a clue because he's the only non-guilty party in that song. Edward Seaton was indeed guilty, so he was not responsible for Edward Seaton's death. He was the only one not invited by UN Owen to the island. He gets a letter from Constance Culmington. And he says that his own death was symbolic in that he was given the mark of Cain on his forehead. And if you look at Cain, it is kind of symbolic that he's marking himself. I mean, who was Cain biblically? Biblically, Cain murdered Abel, so he is the first murderer in kind of this biblical tradition, and that we recognize as the first murderer. So he's given himself the mark of Cain on his forehead, which is what happens in the Bible. But anyways, and then of course his own death is by suicide, and he explains how he is able to kill himself. But Wargrave's victims, Marston, Mrs. Rogers, MacArthur, Emily Brent, Bloor, Armstrong Morse, and himself finally. But it's interesting to note that his two most cold-blooded in terms of the order of his victims. The two most cold-blooded um, murderers, Vera and Lombard, are singled out, and they're kind of pit against each other in this kind of showdown where it's a survival of the fittest, who's the most cold-blooded, right? They kind of have to duel it out for themselves, and he is not directly responsible for killing them. They are responsible for doing away with each other. So it is this kind of, like I said, I know I'm going back to the previous slide, but it is this kind of psychological experience or experiment to see who's going to outlast. And I don't know. That's all I have to say. So, yeah, that's it. That's our novel. We are finished with And Then There Were None, and I'm interested to see if you guys were surprised, shocked, or if you spoiled it for yourself and cheated and saw who done it before you read the novel, which I hope you didn't, because it kind of takes some of the excitement and fun out of it. But I'm really excited to see what you guys think of the ending of our novel and what you guys think about the novel overall and in general. So we have finished our book. So let me know what you guys think, and we'll have more conversations next week.